Hello, my name is Chissell, and I'm Senior Director of Partnerships for Project Drawdown. We know that existing climate solutions, proven technologies and practices, can reduce concentrations of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere and help us reach drawdown. We also know that the human activity that has generated skyrocketing emissions of greenhouse gases has not been a random accident. It has been enabled by a framework of values, mindset, economic and political principles, laws, and regulations. This prevailing set of conditions is the climate, if you will, in which we have created global warming, climate change, and their consequences. To stop catastrophic climate change and to survive the consequences until we can stop it, we need a new climate in which implementation of climate solutions can increase across the board. We need a new set of conditions to operate within. In this session, we'll hear from experts who have spent decades studying, thinking about, and working to put in place a new set of global conditions that can create the enabling environment we need to not only increase climate solutions, but at the same time, repair damage, elevate human well-being, increase quality of life for all people worldwide, achieve justice and liberation for all, and create a world that works for everyone and for our planet. In this session, we'll think together about how to rise to the next level of climate action. Dr. Barbara J. Love is Professor Emeritus of Social Justice Education in the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has worked with a broad range of organizations throughout the US, Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. Her research focuses on personal, organizational, and societal transformation and strategies for liberation. Welcome, Dr. Love.
Thank you, Crystal, for this opportunity to think with you about the climate crisis and how best to achieve drawdown. The world is in an uproar. The danger zone is everywhere. And implementation of workable solutions to the climate crisis seem to come up short. So what is needed? Quoting Einstein, you can't solve a problem on the same level that it was created. You have to rise above it to the next level. So what is the next level of thinking about this climate crisis that we humans face? And what is the framework that will enable effective solutions? I am proposing that critical liberatory consciousness provides the perspective that will enable rising above the problem to develop workable solutions. Solutions, not band-aids. Stopping or slowing global warming is the lower level at which to address this problem. Aiming for drawdown, slowing the Earth's warming, reaching the point where greenhouse gases in the atmosphere peak and begin to decline will not lead to workable solutions. We must aim higher. So how will critical liberatory consciousness help us aim higher and move forward? Critical liberatory consciousness is the mindset that enables continuous awareness, analysis, action, accountability, and allyship to make the micro and macro adjustments that move us toward a world characterized by equity, fairness, and justice. Liberatory consciousness centers a mission of societal transformation. This is the level at which strategies to address the climate crisis must originate. Here's how critical liberatory consciousness works. Let's start with awareness. What are you able to notice? That there is a climate crisis, that's the beginning of awareness. Critical liberatory consciousness requires recognition that the climate crisis was created by the same mindset and in pursuit of the same goals that created colonialism, white supremacy, racism, and genocide. These parallel historical developments go hand in hand. Analysis. Racism, colonialism, and genocide continue to exert primary effects on the development of the climate crisis. It places limitations on efforts to effectively address the climate crisis, and it blocks and limits vision and development of effective strategies to move forward. The climate crisis cannot be effectively dealt with without simultaneously dealing with the effects of colonialism, racism, and genocide. You cannot deal with the one without dealing with the other. Achieving drawdown can only occur within the context of a vision of creating a more just and equitable world, a world that works well for everyone, a world that remediates the effects of colonialism, racism, and genocide. So, given that level of awareness and given that analysis, what action strategies would be most appropriate? Well, what I will do is give you criteria against which each action strategy must be measured. Number one, every action strategy must be analyzed through the lens of whether and to what extent that strategy addresses and seeks to repair the effects of colonialism, racism, and genocide. Second, to what extent were the people who have been targeted by colonialism, racism, and genocide involved in the theorizing and formulation of the strategy? The minds that created the problem may not develop strategies for solving the problem and then bring those already developed strategies to those people who have been targeted and who are still in recovery from colonialism, racism, and genocide, and ask what should be added or how should the proposal be tweaked. Do not bring prepared proposals to those who have been targeted and ask for their help in implementing already developed proposals. And the extent to which any strategy is characterized by paternalism, charity, false generosity, or recreates or leads to the creation of relationships of domination and subordination, to that extent, the strategy is bound to fail. And the third criteria is this: how will the leadership of people of the global majority be centered in the implementation of proposed solutions? Having subjected any proposed solution to this criteria, then you must deal with the issues of accountability and allyship. So, given our time, I will not go into detail about accountability and about allyship, but it's about how do we hold ourselves and each other accountable for seeing to it that the solutions that we propose, the solutions that we develop, meet these criteria, that they ultimately aim toward the creation of a world that works well for everyone. And allyship is built into the project. Indeed, we are all in this together. Together, we will have a livable future on planet Earth. There is no planet B. We will do it together or we will perish. Thank you for this opportunity to imagine that we will indeed calm the climate crisis and create a just and livable future for us all on planet Earth. Thank you, Crystal.
Dr. David Anderson Hooker is Associate Professor of the Practice of Conflict Transformation and Peacebuilding at the University of Notre Dame. He has more than 30 years experience in conflict transformation, peacebuilding, and community organizing, and has managed multi-party conflicts across the US and around the world. Welcome, Dr. Hooker.
Thank you, Crystal. I'm very excited to be here. Hello, my name is David Anderson Hooker. I am a professor of the practice of conflict transformation and peacebuilding at the University of Notre Dame in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. In both my scholarship and my practice, I recognize that achieving a sustainable and quality peace requires the establishment of an integrative and architectonic narrative that supports the conditions that make for peace. When I say integrative, I mean that it should be a narrative in which all issues, anything that would impede the survival and the flourishing of any species, is addressed. Both human and non-living species have to be considered in an integrative narrative. When I say the narrative must be architectonic, that is to say that in addition to personal actions and in considering the relational aspect, we have to attend to building systems and structures that are both adaptable and resilient, but their primary function is to encourage the full flourishing of all. Addressing issues of climate and pending climate change must be an integral part of the narrative. Said differently, any preferred narrative of the future must include all aspects of our existence. Our task, as one of my colleagues often reminds me, is to build a shared narrative or a preferred narrative of a shared future. When considering peace, scholars, practitioners alike recognize that behaviors, relationships, systems all habitually conform to dominant narratives or one of several competing counter narratives. And from psychology, we understand that you can never actually break a habit. You can only replace it. So in order to address peace, which necessarily includes the creating a sustainable, livable climate, we would do well to follow Buckminster Fuller's admonition. Fuller says that in order to change an existing paradigm, you don't struggle and change the problematic model. You create a new model and make. There are clear problematics with the current dominant narrative that must be replaced. Much of the current institutionalized social order is based on globalizing, neoliberal, financialized forms of capitalism that favor hierarchy, extraction, and disposability. This is an inherently unstable social order that creates the illusion of scarcity, pits one group against another, and is prone for both peace and environmental destruction. Replacing a dominant narrative is needed, but what we also need to know is that moralizing will be insufficient. The preferred narrative of a shared future must be both compelling and have a pathway to it. So here's my take. I envision a world in which everyone and everything is included. A world in which every individual, every group, every species has equitable access to the relationships, resources, structures, and testimonial authority that they need to survive, to thrive, to manifest their full capabilities, and to do so in ways that can contribute to a greater good beyond the species itself. Relationships where people are not intentionally, deliberately segregated from one another. Resources prioritized to develop and expand in ways that are sustainable, reproducing, and replacing those that are extractive, diminishing, and harm producing. We know that form follows function, so the structures and the systems have to all point towards sustainability, justice, equity, and well-being. And testimonial authority. Who is it that is to be believed? People who have been previously marginalized are to be believed, and we find ways to listen to the earth and the spirit of the earth. Remember, the narratives are integrative, which means that we recognize that the harms produced by current dominant narratives caused women, non-binary, gender fluid, BIPOC folks to suffer in the same way that many lower and working class people suffer, and ecological damage occurs as a natural outgrowth of this narrative. And so there must be a different way. There are many social movements that have begun to recognize the integrative nature and spoken to this. A while back, there was Occupy. Today, Black Lives Matter, Me Too and Say Her Name, as well as the Sunrise Movement, all account for a certain level of intersectionality between people, but also recognize and regard the conditions of the earth. But how do we get there? How do we move towards this preferred narrative of a shared future? There are a couple of examples of ways that are beginning to do it. The deep democracy movements and the gifting economy move us in the right direction. And there are also a few African principles that I would want to hold up for us that help us to support our work. Ujima, which is collective work and responsibility. Ujamaa, which is cooperative economics, and Ubuntu, the interconnectedness of life, the I am because we are. If we can expand our imagination to understand that those also include the earth, the non-human and non-living portions of our world, then this will expand us to the point where we can build towards a preferred narrative of a shared future, a sustainable equality peace, which necessarily requires a sustainable quality climate. The climate has to be changed so that we can avoid damage of climate change. These are, in the moment, difficult times, but I would take, again, the advice of Buckminster Fuller, who says, there's nothing in the caterpillar that teaches you or that points to the fact that it will one day be a butterfly. We have to build a world today that protects our caterpillars and then have an imagination of a world where butterflies also will flourish. Thank you.
Dana Kawaoka-Chen is the Executive Director of Justice Funders, where she guides philanthropy in reimagining practices that advance a thriving and just world. Welcome, Ms. Kawaoka-Chen.
Thank you, Crystal. Greetings, esteemed colleagues. My name is Dana Kawaoka-Chen, and I am co-director of Justice Funders, a partner and guide for philanthropy and reimagining practices that advance a thriving and just world. In April 2020, activist and author Arundhati Roy wrote, quote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next," end quote. For the next 7 minutes, I invite you to join me in an imaginary portal to a new world. Begin by closing your eyes or softening your gaze. Allow me to be your guide as we travel in time to 30 years in the future. Take a deep breath in, let it out, and here we go. It's 2051. How old are you? How old are your children? Do you have grandchildren? Great-grandchildren? Inhale deeply and note the ability to take a full, round, deep breath, not tainted by smoke. The Californians in the room will remember how more than a third of our state burned in the late teens and early 20s. That was when we relied on incarcerated people to fight fires on lands that we viewed as a source of profit. The combination of racial injustice and climate disaster led to land back campaigns that gave indigenous forest stewards the resources to manage the land as they had since time immemorial. The success of these efforts renewed support for tribes in Oklahoma who were in long contested fights to be recognized as sovereign nations. Wins in Oklahoma led to land in Hawaii and Canada and across the globe to be rematriated to indigenous stewardship, halting generations of trauma as a result of colonization. Do you recall how during the global pandemic of 2019 to 2023, the United States Congress passed an emergency charity stimulus bill after more than 100,000 nonprofit organizations across the country were forced to close their doors? An outcry for increased regulation on philanthropic wealth resulted in a series of laws mandating payouts from donor advised funds within 10 years, minimum payouts of 10%, and the prevention of endowments from being invested in the stock market significantly changed how philanthropic capital was governed. These new laws channeled philanthropic assets into municipal bonds and community development loan funds, which stabilized local municipalities. Coinciding with the passage of the Breathe Act, local cities finally had the resources to make investments in the commons, funding alternatives to policing. We witnessed huge shifts to public education with dramatic differences in per pupil spending because resources were no longer allocated by zip code. Backlash against billionaires spurred community efforts to retain the wealth that their labor created, leading to a growth in cooperative businesses. Frustrated with large corporations who ran their businesses off a contingent workforce that didn't provide minimum labor protections or benefits, much less keep their employees safe during the global pandemic, we saw growth in unions. Worker power and ownership really grew during this period. Local communities began to create their own infrastructure for community wealth through mechanisms like community land trusts, which accelerated efforts to decommodify land. In cities like Richmond, California, and Boston, Massachusetts, which had neighborhoods that were food deserts, the need for locally grown, healthy foods supported the rise of urban farms, which employed returning citizens. The local farms provided produce to cooperative restaurants and stores that also worked with cooperative composters to take commercial and residential food waste to create regenerated soils to sustain the farms. These successes transformed our agricultural practices, so rather than relying on large commercial farms, regenerative farming practices gained prominence, creating food sovereignty. The growth of these efforts required more access to integrated capital, creating the demand for public banks across the country. These shifts really accelerated the just transition from an extractive economy organized around the right to accumulate wealth through the exploitation of labor, extraction of our natural resources, and enforced through militarism to a regenerative economy centered on social equity through ecological restoration and full and fair participatory processes for all people. Within the next decade, our natural resources were revitalized due to federal policies to ban fossil fuels, increase the production of solar and wind, and the migration from corporate-owned to community-owned utilities. The passage of the Thrive Act prioritized renewable, environmentally sound, and ethically sourced energy production from development to deployment. It provided environmental protections and ecological restoration pathways to address the human-caused damage, destruction, degradation of ecosystems by the extractive industries. In the late 20s, a sweeping wealth tax endowed a federal reparations commission. The commission resourced community healing initiatives, honored land grants made to indigenous tribes, and finally paid reparations to all the descendants of US chattel slavery. As a result, corporations and private foundations were required to pay land taxes to local tribes. This led to the requirement of US federal agencies to secure the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous nations related to their environment, lands, water, livelihoods, and culture. Do you remember how this became a period of healing and reconciliation? In the early 30s, the Reparations Commission funded new public monuments in communities across the country. The changing cultural narrative combined with the changing demographics across the country provided the momentum needed to end other archaic reminders of this country's white supremacist history. We finally did away with the Electoral College, created a national paid day off in which to vote, and shuttered the Supreme Court as lingering artifacts of an antiquated democracy. In the 40s, shifts in our governance practices became more visible in every aspect of civic life. Local governments adopted public budgeting processes. Democratically governed community loan funds replaced many philanthropic boards. This is when the political journeys of all were supported by mass base building organizations, as the prior focus on those with wealth were no longer a need. With policy changes in taxation, increased regulation governing corporations and philanthropic wealth, our economy became more regenerative. Everyone had the resources they needed to thrive. The combination of all these shifts contributed to our being able to reverse global warming. As our future selves breathe a collective sigh of relief that our future generations can live on a hospitable planet, I invite you to take another deep breath and rejoin me in 2021. Welcome back. I hope our visit to another portal has renewed your sense of possibility and hope about the future. May this vision offer a pathway forward from the present. As we work to usher in a just transition, I leave you with a reminder from our friends at the Climate Justice Alliance. quote, "We can only undertake global efforts to remediate and restore ecological balance if we redistribute the wealth accrued from stolen lands, stolen lives, and stolen labor to those from whom it was taken and continue to be most impacted by pollution, poverty, racism, state violence, and pandemic across the world," end quote. I welcome co-conspirators in building this world. Crystal, back to you.
Richard Mabion is a veteran community organizer and grassroots environmental activist in Kansas City, Kansas, who has won various environmental awards and is the founder of Building a Sustainable Earth Community, dedicated to environmental organizing in low-income communities. Welcome, Mr. Mabion.
You know, I've been asked to address the conditions that are existing in our climate change, the environment and conservation world. And that's a tremendous subject for me. There are so many different ways that I could approach it that I have really been working hard to be able to zero in on what I want to talk about. So to get that out first, so you'll understand where I'm going, I want to talk about the greenhouse gas reduction part of our climate change work. And the reason I'm bringing that to this is because we all know that in order for us to reach our target dates and to reach that figure reactor in 2050, this program is going to have to be inclusive of everyone, all portions of the population. Now, that's not necessarily saying that everybody in those portions have to be directly involved, but each segment, not only in America, but around the planet, needs to be engaged in reducing our carbon footprint. And my concern with the work that I do in our inner cities, our people aren't even recycling. And that's one of the lowest hanging fruit on the vine. So I'm making that my comments about that. So the first thing I'm gonna do is set a scene for. I want everybody to think about the circumstances that happened in New Orleans in 2005 with the Katrina tragedy. And I want you to think about when the nightly TV shows were on the news, how they showed people that just milling around, looking lost, confused, clueless. Looked like there was no local leadership to give them directions on what they could do. If it hadn't been for the Superdome and our first responders, you know, we don't know how many people we would have lost during that tragedy. But it was that incident that made me become acutely aware of this environmental world. And it made me want to learn more about it. So I found a book. This we talked in it wasn't to 2006, but I found this book by a guy named David Corton. And the book's title was The Great Turning. As far as I'm concerned, it was a great book because that book is what has me sitting here right now speaking to you. And it has been guiding my actions ever since I read it. Didn't take very long for him to reach me. About the first four or five pages within the first chapter, he made a comment. He said, leadership for the world that we are going to be working with will come from the people who have suffered the most injustices in life. As a former community organizer from the 70s, working in the civil rights movement, I knew exactly what people he was talking about, not necessarily Black, but low income, multiculturally. And I realized that if someone Black did not get inside this environmental world and learn it from the inside out, when it came time for that leader to exist in the Black community, they may or may not exist. And that is what propelled me into being a part of this movement. I spent the next from 2006 all the way up to 2019 doing nothing but experimenting, trying programs, doing this, doing that. In 2019, Cornell University started their first online climate change action course. And unfortunately, out of 600 applicants, they selected 30, and yours truly got to be one of the 30s. Oldest thing in the room, but I got to be one of the 30s. And the one thing that made it so significant, out of the 30, only 5 of us were from the United States. Everyone else was from all over the planet. I mean, various parts, South America, Africa, Bahamas, you name it. We had people there that were actively engaged in this environmental movement. And so they were all sharing what was going on in their places. And it was a really good lesson to have. I had one of my team members, they divided us in teams of 4, and one of them was from Nigeria. And he talked about a 1,500 kilometer wall that they had built over there called the Green Wall. And it was where they had planted trees. And it was just a tremendous experience hearing him talk about that. But at the same time, because they weren't reaching the low-income community, because firewood is a staple for them, would cut down the trees. And so that's what gave us a chance to be able to engage in this conversation. And out of that came, once they saw what I was doing in Kansas City, they decided, you know, this is something we can do back at our place. So that got me to create what's called a climate change consciousness for the low-income community. Now I'm gonna back up to my days as a community organizer. The thing that was very beneficial back there, I worked for a company that worked in a umbrella kind of organization, kind of like you hear people talking about now. And in that umbrella organization, like the center pole would be the central office. And here, everyone there was an expert in their areas, whether it was healthcare, whether it was youth programs, whether it was elderly, whether it was employment, training, you name it, that person was at that office. And also accounting. And then they had 5 individual neighborhoods. That's where the tentacles from the umbrella sit. And in each one of those neighborhoods, they hired an executive director. Usually back in those days, it was someone that was coming from James Adams School of Social Work. So you had a really sharp person that was the executive director. And then they would hire people out of the neighborhood who would be the youth workers, the age worker, the health worker. So that way, those people knew the folks that they were going to be working with. It wasn't nothing new. They knew them, had grown up with them, knew their kids, went to school with their kids. That whole thing was a benefit for being able to get inside the doors. And then they would hire a person like me. I graduated from college. They hired me as a citizen participation specialist. When I saw that thing in Katrina, that's what I knew was missing in the environmental world. Because see, we don't go out and talk to people and make them aware of what this environmental world is all about. People aren't recycling because no one's talked to them. They just showed up one day and all of a sudden you got a bucket, you start putting your stuff out there. But the reason for doing it has never been talked to them in such a way where they would be able to understand it and hear. So that's when I'm coming with my proposition on you now. I'd like to see that kind of umbrella program being used in our inner cities. I'm only focusing on the inner city. And what we should be able to do is to have what would be considered a central office that had those kinds of professionals working in, especially accountant, to be able to work, to be accountable as far as how the money's being spent and the kind of programs that's being designed. And those people would provide the executive directors of your social service agencies. And I'm talking about people's social service agencies with the kind of leadership they need so they and their staff become climate change minded. Then a person like me, I'm only using me as a character, should be hired as the Green Czar facilitator. And that person should be the one that's directing our environmental and conservation concerns to those executive directors, to the staff, and then working with the staff to teach the clients. If we want to have a successful greenhouse gas program, we need to be able to reach the low income portion of the population too. I see this as an ideal way of being able to provide the kind of leadership that's needed in the areas where trust is a factor. When you start hiring people and training people that are brothers and sisters of the folks that you're training, it makes a big difference in how much of it they receive. Thank you.
Asad Rehman is the Executive Director of War on Want, a charity in the UK working on issues of global poverty, human rights, and climate justice. He has over 35 years of experience campaigning around social, economic, climate, and racial justice issues, as well as being involved in global movements around climate justice and migration. Welcome, Mr. Rehman.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to join so many inspiring voices from all over the world. I want to begin my brief remarks by reiterating a truth that is universal. Yet for centuries, people all over the world have worked for, marched for, and died for, hoping for it to be realized. That is, everyone, simply by being born into our world, has the right to a dignified life. And I think it's this lens that must guide all of our discussions. We know full well that our planet's richness lies in its diversity. Despite our immense plurality as human beings, we're of course all bound together by common needs and hopes. All cultures and peoples value health, joy, love, care, and justice. And we all strive for lives with meaning, freedom, and safety. Yet we know that the world does not reflect our dreams. For the majority of the world's population, especially the vulnerable in our societies, life is painful and unnecessarily hard. And yet we live in a time of violent contrasts, colossal wealth and immense poverty, chronic hunger and plentiful food, restrictive systems and abundant possibilities. To understand how we should redirect our collective energy, our intelligence and our ingenuity to solve these problems, I think first we must ensure we all understand how we get here. And that is a story of sacrifice, of centuries of people and ecosystems made disposable, dispossessed for the possessions of a few. And the exploitation of nature, of course, goes in hand with the exploitation of people, expendable facets of the exploitation of expendable lands. And the dominant social and economic system that has been imposed across all of the world, forged in the age of colonialism, has enforced an unwritten law, development through destruction. And this destructive system was forced into dominance. It's created an economy of cruelty and not care. And the many other ways of seeing, of being, and of organizing human life have been sidelined, silenced, and erased. And I think the imposition of this destructive economic system, which of course has been brought to us over centuries, is at the core of this precipice of ecological breakdown, historical inequality, and social division. And so today we face this civilizational crisis, as well as a politics that threatens us all. And of course, in this overlay of multiple crises that make up this complex crisis with many causes, the only way to really do justice to these multiple and multi-causal problems and complex issues is to approach them from multiple lenses and perspectives. And so whilst there are many ways to unpack our current moment and various vocabularies in which we try and explain it, I think there are four key elements which are crucial. Of course, the ecological breakdown, but alongside it, the crisis of inequality, the unraveling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the systems of oppression that are hardwired into our societies and economies, which if we fail to address, we cannot hope to build the social license needed for the transformation required. Now, we all know that we depend on a planetary ecosystem for life, yet centuries of pollution and plunder have drastically deteriorated ecosystems and brought them to a tipping point. Key biophysical guardrails which allow for human life to safely thrive have already been crossed or are set to be crossed. And that violence that we've inflicted against the environment, of course, is that it depends on mirrors the violence within our societies, which have been riven by poverties and disparities. And this world of abundant inequalities, where wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of a few, whilst the majority of our fellow human beings have been deprived from one or more of the basic needs required for a dignified life: clean water, nutritious food, affordable housing, sanitation, energy, or adequate healthcare. And alongside that, of course, we all recognize that income inequality has risen in virtually every country in recent decades. And that's been fostered by the unjust trade rules, the debts, the poverty wages, and exploitative relations that date back centuries. And the engine, of course, in recent decades has been the immense concentration of power by large corporations. And it's this acceleration of inequality and breakdown of social cohesion that has also laid the ground for authoritarian politics to flourish. We all can all see fragile democracies and hard-won rights that sustain them have all faced the resurgence of old threats as forces of hatred, fascism, and division are being emboldened. So we all know that that ultimately we have to confront inequality as it sits at the root of our interconnected crisis. Saadia Hartman, the renowned author and academic, said, so much of the work of oppression is policing the imagination. And in a world riven by deep imbalances of power generated by these historical injustices of recognition, distribution, exclusion, these systems have become entrenched over time through things such as racialized capitalism. And it's key that we do not see these as historical abstractions, but as part of the current systems which have led us to these concrete and unequal realities. So that as a result, we're not just unequal, but we're unequal neither in our exposure to violence or injustice, but also in our capacity to address it. So acknowledging their existence and lineage is a first key step, because unless we actively put as a core objective being able to identify and uproot these systems, they will remain in place in our solutions. So if, for example, our transition towards a green economy does not account for colonial injustices and its history of extraction of resources and wealth, then it will simply deepen those very same inequalities in the name of green recovery. And in the backdrop of the COVID pandemic, which is accelerating all around us, and which we all recognize as being an X-ray on our societies, exposing all these deep economic, social, racial, and gender inequalities that exist within our societies and between our societies, we can all know one truth, that it's the most vulnerable who've been the hardest hit, and it is those who will be denied access to the same life-saving vaccines in the name of corporate profit. But this pandemic has not only been a crisis of health, because it's combined with these other epidemics of inequality, of rising racism and spiraling climate breakdown. And this collision of this crisis has brought us to this watershed moment. How do we reshape our world? Now, I think the reality is that the majority of global institutions find themselves with their backs to reality. Given the urgency, only a profound change of course will do. And this wake-up call, of course, has been constantly reiterated, even most recently by the scientific institutions such as UNEP, which outlined a conclusion familiar to social movements all around the world. A rapid and just transformation of our economy is imperative to prevent cataclysmic further levels of warning. So whilst all the crises we face may be joined up, often our calls for change are still siloed and segmented. So how do we braid together our collective visions? And that really requires us to take effort of care, listening, and dialogue. And it also requires us to be connective in our thinking, organizing, and doing. After all, we all know that intersectional approaches are actually precise approaches. So to address inequality through economic programs, we can't allow that to deepen the climate crisis. Neither can we have a green or climate-friendly recovery that simply sacrifices the South or aggravates the inequalities that make climate violence so devastating. With ecological breakdown, for example, the solution is not simply to look at it as a reduction of emissions, but actually as a reduction of injustices, where every gradient of warming we fail to slow down also needs to be compensated by an equal reduction in deprivation. But this overlapping crisis also hands us an incredible and unprecedented opportunity to build a better collective future. So we know that we have the technical solutions in place to force down emissions while increasing people's access to energy. We know we can construct a democratic economy that respects ecological limits and serves the needs of people rather than the luxurious lifestyles of a small elite. We know we can deliver a better economy. But how do we do this when we have to dance with the double-edged nature of urgency, of doing things fast, but also with attentiveness to the process of action? And that, of course, requires us to operate at multiple levels, at national level, at local level, but also at the international level. Of course, we need to work to popularize and build a new paradigm of dignity and well-being, one that centers plurality and care. And whilst all those obstacles may be great, there is ample hope. And such a hope and a transition, I think, is only feasible through when we say we have to have a reduction in demand, a reduction in and an increase in collaboration, and a harnessing of technologies that can provide sufficient energy for all in this well-being economy. But we know one thing for sure: we can't do this in isolation. You can't tackle a global crisis through a single lens or through a single issue. So of course we need a pluriverse, a joined up effort. When together we can begin to weave what that economy of justice looks like. How do we fight to vindicate life? How do we make sure that the planet is a home for all? And I want to put forward this proposition that to realize that transformation, we need a global Green New Deal. So what is that? Well, when we face a complex, interconnected global crisis, of course, we can see that it's an intricate tapestry of 1,000 threads. But actually, when you focus down, you see within these threads, whilst it's sometimes difficult to prioritize every intervention needed, the global Green New Deal can provide us an opportunity collectively and participatory to identify and prioritize what are the most important interventions, what are the core ideas and demands that can sit within that unpicking of this intricate tapestry. So Robin Kelly reminds us that without new visions, we don't know what to build, only to know what we want to knock down. We can end up confused, rudderless, and cynical. And we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. And I think the Global Green New Deal can provide that alternative, active and positive vision that fends off the kind of despair that we're seeing that leads us to the minimalist and mainstream stagnation. But the Global Green Deal frame can also act as a useful metaphor for the kind of ambitious global and collective action. So as I said, whilst we know that defining one single framework for the entire world is difficult, if we start with a simple question as I began, if everyone has a right to a dignified life, what does that mean? And what do we need to guarantee that? Then we find ourselves committing to limiting temperatures to prevent a breach of the 1.5 degree guardrail. We find ourselves recognizing that this is decade zero, when we decide how much of the planet and how many people we're willing to sacrifice at the altar of promises to act in the future or betting on future unproven technologies. Instead, if we say clearly that guaranteeing a dignified life means contesting that future with the politics of imagination, it leads us to a place where we're saying we can guarantee energy, food and water for all as public goods. It means protecting the commons. It means building an economy geared around, of course, caring and sharing, but actually investing in the public services that we've all identified as so critical, from health and education to housing. Of course, it means launching ambitious ecological jobs programs, but it also means eradicating poverty through guaranteed incomes and living wages and social protection. And none of that is possible without eliminating all of that international, racial and gender-based wealth gap that exists. And so investing in the infrastructure of our marginalized communities based on those communities' terms is critical. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with the need for debt cancellation, for recognizing care, and the reparations that are needed to finance this global transformation. We have been working with movements all over the world, and all of them are weaving their realities and their solutions together and putting people and planet first. And given the immense resistance of political elites and the inertia of the status quo, it is only by the progressive social movements that provide us with the hope to build the kind of significant power and the energy behind both a collective vision and a political framework that will lead us out of this multiple crisis. Thank you.